Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, can you please share your name, organization, and what brings you here today in the chat? And so we can see who is joining us and what the audience out there looks like. And we'll kick this off. We'll give a couple minutes and kick this off a little after 9.
Thanks.
Good morning. Hey, Chris. Good morning. Hope you made it through the IB traffic this morning, like I did. Pretty bad on the 5 South. National City, great. Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the second webinar of our 6-part series, Leaders for Outdoor Equity. My name is Chantel Jimenez, and I am the SoCal Urban Refuge Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has partnered with the University of San Diego's nonprofit institute, the Outdoor Foundation, Thrive Outside San Diego, the San Diego Foundation, and Outdoor Outreach to put on this series for you. The purpose of the Leaders for Outdoor Equity series is to give land managers and recreational leaders from public agencies, nonprofit, and the outdoor industry an opportunity to learn about the vital role outdoor access and public lands has for our health, well-being, and quality of life. It is also meant to deepen our understanding and leadership skills around the issues of race and equity as they relate to the outdoors. It is with this, I want to take a moment to support our Indigenous communities and acknowledge that San Diego, where I'm currently sitting, is Kumeyaay, Luiseño, Kumeyaay, and Kupeño traditional homelands. For millennia, Indigenous people have lived in balance and harmony with the land, giving invaluable knowledge and inspirational worldview. We must move forward with purpose, listening to their voices, respecting their land, and creating a more equitable access for all. As you know, we are asking you to share in the chat box in a few words what brings you here today. I am going to wait a few moments while people put in their responses in the chat and encourage you all to read what others are saying and look at where people are coming from across the United States. I saw someone from Los Angeles earlier, where I was born and raised, in Kentucky. It's great. A little California representatives all the way out to Kentucky. We got Helen, a Fish and Wildlife Service colleague up in Alaska. Nice to see you here, Helen. Idaho. Good. Good morning to the West Coasters, afternoon to the East Coasters, and everyone in between. Awesome. All right. Good stuff. Exciting. All right, so during our previous webinar, we talked about the less told stories and the history of public lands and explored how those stories can help us find new ways to approach and promote a more inclusive access to and management of our urban refuges, city, state and national parks, national forests, and other public lands. In order for our public lands to remain relevant and valued to an increasingly diverse public, we need to tell these more inclusive stories about the history of our outdoor spaces that relate to people of all backgrounds and lived experiences. In today's webinar, we will discuss the systemic challenges in outdoor access and land management, particular perceptual barriers. Despite the numerous benefits there are to being outdoors, mental, spiritual, physical, we still lack inclusivity and equity in this space. We come together for this series out of common love for the outdoor. And as with any educational experience, this series may challenge your current understanding of our public lands. We encourage you to sit with and reflect upon the insights and perspectives offered by our different speakers, because all of you are going to be part of what happens next. As we gain a richer understanding about the history of our public lands by hearing from more diverse voices and the challenges that we face in managing public lands, what does our new shared story become? And how do we chart a path forward for the next century together in our common love for the natural world found both in the vast and wild open spaces of our national parks, as well as the more urbanized refuges of nature we have in many communities across the country? And now, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Duncan from Outdoor Outreach, who will introduce our panel of speakers today.
Thanks so much, Chantel, and good morning again, everyone. My name is Lesford Duncan, or Les Duncan. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at a nonprofit here in San Diego called Outdoor Outreach. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us for this series. We look forward to learning with you and from you over the course of these webinars. Before we go into this morning's speakers, I'd like to go over just a few logistics. Our virtual webinar series will convene today and monthly from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time through December. But a smaller group or smaller cohort of you will and also have been participating in leadership seminars as well, which include a capstone project. The leadership seminars, which are led by Dr. Zachary Green from University of San Diego, will convene immediately after the webinar. And you've been provided with a separate Zoom link for that webinar, for that session. We'll start by hearing from three speakers today: Teresa Baker, Richard Bugbee, and Jose Gonzalez, who will talk about their backgrounds and what got them into outdoor equity work and what inspires them to do the work they're doing now in the organizations and movements that they work with. We'll then move into a panel conversation and open it up for Q&A with the audience. Throughout today's program, as we explore issues of race, equity, inclusion, and public lands, think about what gets activated within you. Think about what actions are suggested by what you learn here. Think about what you can do from your role to be more of a leader for outdoor equity. We invite you to use this time, this space, as an opportunity for self-reflection, as well as an opportunity to learn together with us and with others. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, my dear sister and self-proclaimed troublemaker, Teresa Baker. Teresa is the founder of the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge, which connects leading outdoor brands with inclusion advocates to advance representation for people of color across the industry. She also started the African American National Park Event Project, which campaigns for more participation from the African American population to get outside and to go to local national parks and be involved in guided hikes and cleanups. Her vision is anchored in interacting with outdoor entities such as outdoor retailers, NGOs and nonprofits, and federal agencies who are having difficulty engaging diverse audiences within their organization and in outdoor arenas, such as national parks. Teresa Baker, take it away from here.
Thanks, Les. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm having some technical issues this morning. But yeah, as Les stated, Teresa Baker. I grew up in Richmond, California. And growing up, it was, from my parents, get outdoors, stay outdoors until the streetlights come on. So we were always outdoors. And I was surrounded by outdoor spaces, hiking trails, everything, state parks, regional parks. So being outdoors in nature was natural for me. It wasn't until I became an adult that I really understood my role in protecting these outdoor spaces. And during a trip in 2016 to Yosemite National Park, I had gone to Yosemite almost every month for years. But on this particular trip, I spent a week in Yosemite Valley, and not one other person that looked like me did I see. And for whatever reason, I took notice to that. I don't really know why. But once I got back home, I reached out to the National Park Service and I said, hey, you guys have a diversity problem. And they said to me, we know, help us fix it. And that began my journey around diversity and inclusion in the outdoor spaces. I didn't even know there was a title for it, but I'm thankful that the National Park Service was open to hearing my concerns. And since then, we've developed a relationship, working on projects together to engage people from underrepresented communities and making sure that diversity is atop their list of things that they are committing to. So that's who I am. That's why I am. And yeah, I'm sure there'll be more to share as we move along, but that's the foundation. Thanks, Les.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Teresa, and thanks for sharing your story and what brings you to this work. We'll hold questions until we hear from each of our speakers. And so with that said, please feel free to post your questions as they come up for you in the chat box. I'd like to now ask the audience also just to make note of what it is that you're hearing throughout this conversation that you may not have heard before, or something that you're reflecting on. And as you do that, take time to really sit with the things that might come up as uncomfortable or things that may not necessarily resonate with your personal story, but still holding space for that. Setting it aside within your mind and taking that up again at a later point, and really reflecting on how it applies back to your work. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to our next speaker, Richard Bugbee. Richard, I'll ask your forgiveness as well if I mispronounce this and your correction. Richard is a Payomkowishum elder of the Luiseño tribe based in Topanga in Los Angeles County, and has been a Southern California tribal cultural practitioner for over 20 years. Mr. Bugbee has spent many years sharing his ethnobotany knowledge, learned through many years of mentorship and furthered through an apprenticeship with his mentor, renowned Kumeyaay knowledge keeper, Jane Dumas. Currently, Richard is an instructor at Kumeyaay Community College teaching courses in Kumeyaay ethnobotany and ethnoecology. He is also on the board of directors for Indigenous Regeneration and advocates for Indigenous California language survival. Richard, if you would, please take it from here.
Welcome, notung ipakwishmak yaka, notung Richard Bugbee yaka, nom Payomkowishum. Anyway, I'm Richard Bugbee. I'm Luiseño or Payomkowishum, but a lot of my knowledge is Kumeyaay. My teacher was Kumeyaay. I actually grew up in Kumeyaay territory in a village site called Kumeyaay, and it's now called Old Town San Diego. So my playground actually was the river, a valley, and the mesa there where USD is. And that was actually a place where I used to take my bicycle and race road runners. So instead of growing up next to, the only park I really had was Presidio Park. And besides that, everything was open canyons, and I guess the only dangerous thing out there was rattlesnakes. And so my grandfather told me that if I'm good, the rattlesnakes will leave me alone, and if I'm bad, they'll bite me. And so it kind of kept me good for a long time. And it kind of worked because I never got bit. Anyway, so I have a deal with rattlesnakes that I will not bite them and they won't bite me. And so we were pretty well. A lot of the time I lived up, you said I lived up in Topanga Canyon. I no longer, I've moved back to San Diego, moved back actually to Payomkowishum territory, which is just northeast of Escondido. And so I'm back on my tribal land that my great grandmother grew up on. But I'm familiar with San Diego. I'm familiar with Mission Bay, and hanging out there and observing nature. And I think the problem with people today, they're trying to reconnect with nature, and that's a problem because you don't reconnect with something that you're a part of. I remember doing where we looked at an exhibit, and it was for natural history exhibits, and there was no people in it, or just animals and plants. And I said, well, where's the people? Aren't we part of natural history? And we are. We're part of nature. So it's looking at nature is kind of looking at a reflection of yourself, and that's. You mentioned I work for the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. That's why we call it ICLS, because that's too long. Anyway, because we have like over 100 languages in California. And those are actually, each one of those languages are different because we all live in different environments. And these languages are reflections to those environments. And so once you learn those languages, you reconnect with the environment. They're just, Kumeyaay, the sky is Maiha. Maiha means the water above. There's just a connection. The earth is mutt. Your body is mutt. They're a little bit different, but they sound the same. And so, here, and it just connects you that way. Anyway, so I work a lot with plants, but I also work a lot with language, and kind of connect the people with the plants, and connect them, for tens of thousands of years. The people and the plants and the land and the animals were all had this reciprocal relationship with each other, and that includes humans. And for the last 500 years, that relationship has been severed, and then it's trying to be put together under the name of management. And then it doesn't work. It has to be in the terms of a relationship with the plants and animals. Sometimes when I'm growing, it's hard to gather native plants in the native spaces anymore because all the land's kind of taken up. So I ended up trying to grow it in my own yard. And when it tried to misbehave, I used to scold it and stuff, and it actually listened to me, and it worked out fine. Anyway, we've lost that relationship with the plants and connection, and treat it as we treat plants as kind of like objects, or and we don't treat them like living beings that they are. Anyway. And I don't know, I just like to reconnect people with or especially Native people with their language and their plants, and find sometimes it's difficult to I lived across the street from Topanga State Park for 25 years, and I offered my training and stuff, and they never accepted it, and they really treated me like a thief or something when I went onto the property, and it really hurt me because I was advisor to the director for the state parks for several years, and I could see sometimes I get to a meeting early at the state park, and they treat me like I was a homeless person or something. And then when they found out I worked for the director, they all of a sudden offered me a cup of coffee, and were real nice. And it's like, wow, that's 180 degrees. Anyway, so I see a lot of problems with people of color, with certain agencies, and it's the same way up in Northern California with the firefighters. It's only the Native people that don't look Native get promoted, and it's really hard to get promoted into the firefighting system. So our techniques are like put aside, and I'm actually a very big advocate of combining firefighting technologies of today with the knowledge we have of doing fires, and I'll probably talk about that later. So I think anything else?
Thank you so much, Richard. And I'm super excited. One of the quotes that I shared in the chat box that you shared was that you can't reconnect people to land or to nature, and I'm paraphrasing, that they're already a part of. And I think
it's like reattaching a severed arm or something.
Exactly. And I mean, I think one of the points of this seminar is really to talk about kind of the need to connect, to not only connect, but to recognize the connection between people and nature, and that people are a part of nature, and that inherently that is the reason why we advocate for equity and access for all, and enjoying the benefits of it, the physical, the mental health, the emotional, the spiritual benefits of it. And so I look forward to chatting with you more about that in the panel discussion. So thank you again for sharing your story, sharing your experiences, and what brings you here today as well. Again, I'd like to ask the audience to make note of what is coming up for you, what you're hearing throughout each of these presentations. Take time to sit with it, to reflect on it, and to make space in your mind to kind of to grapple with the different experiences and the different realities that you're hearing through each of these presentations as well. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, good friend and karaoke master, Jose Gonzalez. Jose is the founder and former executive director of Latino Outdoors, a network of leaders committed to engaging Latinos in the outdoors, connecting families and youth with nature, and empowering their community of storytellers to explore and share their personal experiences. He is an experienced educator and partner with the Avarna group, which creates pathways, provides resources, and innovates strategies to support the outdoor and environmental sector in their evolution towards justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Jose, if you would, please feel free to start us off with a song, or you could just hop right into your presentation as well.
Thank you so much, Les. I will not attempt the one that we both failed at miserably down in San Diego. That's for another time. I do want to say thank you. First of all, good morning. Morning blessings. Buenos dias. My name is Jose Gonzalez. Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales, actually de Leon. Teresa does get on my case once she found out that I have Adonis as part of my name. And I'm greeting he, him, his, although I'll respond to anything offered with joy and respect. And I'm greeting you all from ancestral, traditional, stolen, and unceded lands, the Nisenan, Southern Maidu, Miwok, among others in what is at the moment Sacramento, Sacraslan, Califas. And I'm excited to be here for a variety of reasons. Shout out, of course, to the whole Latino Outdoors community, and especially the San Diego team right there. I believe there's a few of you in attendance here, so I'm excited because for me that is a basis of what this work is about. Community power, and to Richard's point, really rethinking about what we mean as a reconnection. And so I'm going to share a couple of slides because I have some of this available and I often get asked about what's presented. So I'll share them just as snapshots that hopefully will also lead us into the panel discussion, but connect to what Teresa and Richard have shared from an additional perspective in terms of my path. So it's really meant to be very complementary to it. So hopefully you can all see this. This is me having the pleasure of running out in New Mexico for a project. And I like this photo for a variety of reasons. Just that space of being on the land, trail running, which is something I reconnected to late in life. Definitely can't keep up with Les or any other peers and colleagues who did it earlier in their lives. And this is a bandana, un pañuelo, from a colleague down in Tucson, Arizona. You can follow him online, Instagram, Huaraches Verdes, because it also shows these connections and remembering. That probably remembering is even stronger than reconnection, to Richard's point, right? It's like you are remembering, you're reattaching something that that has been severed, and that actually really connects to how I'm approaching this work at the moment. And it all started with me really as, you know, how do I anchor this work of my own individual practice and growth, as well as the work that I tend to do with organizations? So when we ask these questions about, like, quote unquote, how do I get more people of color connected to the outdoors? I'm like, let's unpack all of that to see what you mean, what you're looking for, and what that looks like. Because there's a lot even in there. And Richard and both Teresa packed a lot in their comments. And part of my work from an education background is to really like get into the nuance of that and pay attention to the richness of what's been shared, because there's a lot in there that's being gifted through different and additional formats than some of us may be used to hearing. And I really want to stress that, right? Because I can give you the PowerPoint presentation, but to sit and listen to a narrative information sharing, if you are not haven't really paid attention to it in that way before, can be incredibly transformative. And so knowing and doing and changing is one of the ways that I approach this work. The knowing is sometimes I just need to know better, to do so that I can do better, and then actually change for the better. And I add additional terms to knowing is the awareness work, doing is the action work, and changing is the transformation work. And that this applies across our respective affinity phases. That's what I put. There's the work that white people need to do for and with themselves. That is their labor. And there's the work that our communities of color, our racial and ethnically diverse communities also need to do our work ourselves, because as much as many of us are confronting privilege, others of us are healing from that, and it can overlap. One thing at a time. These I have because they're representative, very different data sets of the reality of how the United States is changing demographically, and that's not going to just disappear. So I share this because it the way that I approach the work is to say, I anchor these in realities. Now we can choose to ignore them. We can choose to resist them. We can choose to be in denial and whatnot. But come 2050, it's just going to be a very different country in terms of demographic representation than 1950. Right? And so we're either working with and embracing as to how that's a beautiful thing to receive, or we are, more or less harming ourselves and getting ready for that. And I also anchor that as that demographic shift is happening, it has impact, not just in representation and visibility and the reality of that we're here. Oh, what is going on? There we go. And that also in who is in the decision-making spaces, the spaces of power. So that you can take a moment like the 1960s civil rights movement, especially for the Black African-American community, as a way to finally say, hey, how we actually legally change the law and actually not have physical signs that say that if you are white, you can use this store or use these resources, and if you're not, you have to use these. Like that's very visible oppression in that way. And just because we changed the law doesn't mean that the social and cultural and political dynamics automatically changed. And so that's part of how anchoring this work as well. What happens as we acknowledge and increase that, hey, now we're in decision-making spaces of power. What is the reality of that? And Richard, even his example about saying, oh, all of a sudden they realize that I have this association with the director and I'm treated differently. And it shouldn't have to be that way. Right, that power, that's an aspect of power that comes into play. And this is from Charles Thomas, who's the executive director of Outward Bound Adventures. Highly recommend that if you're unfamiliar with Outward Bound Adventures, not the same as Outward Bound or Outward Bound California, but they are an amazing organization to check out and support. And it's this idea of like when we talk about systemic barriers, whether they're real or perceptual, it recognizes that it's easy to engage with those of us that already kind of have a foot on the trail, so to speak. And then it's easy to be dismissive or to just not do the hard work for those that really don't want to, without understanding what maybe the reasons they don't want to, that aren't just personal. There's always going to be people that don't do something. Understanding some of the reasons as to why that has developed, it's a bit more work because there's history there. There is historical oppression and trauma of who has been included and not included, forcibly removed. There's genocides, there's slavery, like you name it. That is also an anchored reality. And that affects how it represents in the now. So you can look at I use these as examples to be able to say like, oh, especially over the last 10 years, if not 20, especially over the last 10, we've gotten more quote unquote data. And it's interesting because it's helpful for us to put numbers on like what has been lived experience, but it's always been true. And so this can help us understand as to say, what do we mean by representation, but then dive into that a little deeper. So you can look at a visual like this from the Outdoor Industry Association, the Outdoor Foundation, and say, well, look, you see the described Black demographic here is green as relatively low compared to others. And then we can look at other information and say, look, here's another example in 2017 Nature of American Studies, in which what stands out here is that interest in hiking is lowest among Black adults, 19%. And that can reinforce this narrative, right? Of like, there's no interest, they're not out there, not willing to engage. If we don't ask that question of what can be below that? Because if we ask the question, interest in walking outdoors, all of a sudden those shoot up. And so for me, it's the question of like, so what's different between hiking and walking outdoors? Right? Is there an actual physical difference, an actual experiential difference compared to a perceived difference cultural experience? That when I think of hiking, this is what systemically has been set up to say you are included and not. So those are what I mean about the interrogations. Quickly go through the rest of these. And so that invites us into the shift. I think Teresa and Richard both laid this well. So what does it look like to shift our approach and our thinking and our framework? So a lot of you that have engaged in work like the tenets or principles of white supremacy, characteristics of white supremacy, and so forth, it's about rethinking the shift about what has been designed in place for those of us with power and privilege for whom it's normative. I can move in the world in many ways that are pretty accepting of me. But that doesn't mean everybody was included in that design. As Dr. Carolyn Finney likes to say, some of these spaces weren't designed with me in mind as a Black woman. So what does it mean now to rethink about the redesigning of these spaces, physical, cultural, political, and so forth? So an example of that, won't go through all of these, but you may begin to pay attention to a lot of this either or binary thinking that might be present in the way that we are inclusive, that we make decisions, like you name it. And how do we shift that to a systems and complexity thinking that understand both and, that understand holding a lot more nuance? And that can lead you not just to say, oh yeah, people are either racist or not racist, or good or bad. As an example for me, it's like I can be impacted by systemic oppression as a Latino male and benefit from the power and privilege of my gender identity in terms of identifying as heteronormative, as a heteronormative man. And I can be a good person and still be complicit in oppressive systems that were designed before me. Now that's harder to work with, but it's still necessary compared to just saying, well, I can't be one of the bad people. I mean well. And this points, last couple of slides. So hence this idea of, like, as Les has been mentioning, the power of reflection, to sit with the invitation of listening and being for the purposes of growing, rather than defensiveness or letting specific aspects of fragility undo that work. So you can ask, why does this unsettle me? I just react. It's like, oh, wait, what? I can't, that can't be true for me. Well, what does it mean if it's true? And then I can add aspects to that to say, well, if the question is, how does this lens change my understanding? I could ask, how does this lens change my understanding of racial dynamics in this community and beyond? Is it possible there are dynamics I don't see? Is it possible that because I am a male, there are some gender dynamics I don't see? Because if I'm a white male, there's some racial dynamics I don't see. Now you are engaging in the work. And this is powerful because, in closing, for me, is when I receive gifts like this one from Dr. Rupia Myra, who is looking at, like, the interconnection elements of harm. This is what we suffer from. This is what a lot of us say we're against and working to change. And we use terms like colonization. And for me, I was like, I look at that to say, fundamentally, what is it that I need to approach this differently? And to Richard's point, if I look at colonization as really this perpetuation of a mechanistic reductionist worldview that others and objectifies in ways so that I can have power over a person, over other non-human kin or members of the ecosystem or ecological community, then I begin to shift to think that, what does it mean if I reconnect or remember, or really accept the awareness that I am a part of that community, and then approach it from a life-honoring worldview. And if you really sit and pay attention and receive the gifts of ancestral knowledge, and for what a lot of Native communities have been like trying to hold, even in the face of systemic genocide, like, this is what some of that shift is and can be. And so I can then think about, I use this as an example, rather than thinking about saying, wow, this team is running like a well-oiled machine. That's that kind of mechanistic language that has permeated some of this work. And I can say, well, what happens if I say that team is running like a well-nurtured meadow? How does that change or challenge my ideas around leadership, about teams, about what we value in terms of contributions, about pacing, around time, like it names it that way. And I'm excited to hear more about Richard's about fire, because that's another example that I've understood how I approach this work in a lot of the quote unquote DEI work. And then the last one is I use this is from FSG, about when we talk about structural and systemic change, is that there's elements for all these pieces. The structural can be explicit in terms of change of policy, change of practice, change resource flows, who is in what position, what money is coming in. Relational is that about holding the space with each other, how trust is built, how power is shared, transition, co-shared, and so forth. And then the mental models, somebody commented there, like implicit bias, implicit cognitive bias, right? It's reshifting these mental models so it allows us to be able to engage with some of this work differently. Because at the end of the day, all of this is, can be intellectually there, and we can over-intellectualize the work, but it has real impact on the youth, on our communities, on play, on joy, on what is it that we elevate and not. And so, as an example, the reason why it's important to elevate something like Black joy is because that's an example of what systemically tends to be oppressed or misrepresented, or I think oppressed is just the right word. And so I'll close there and get it ready for Les.
Thanks so much for that, Jose, and thanks at the end of that presentation also centering Black joy. As we go through each of these topics and these talks, one of the things that we've really been centering is the power of new narratives, or different narratives. I shouldn't say new narratives, because as Richard mentioned before, we all have this deep connection to nature that has existed for centuries, but bringing in more diverse narratives and stories to this work is so important. So thank you again, Jose, for sharing more about your story and for unpacking some of the nuances in this work. And so now, as I mentioned before, now that you've heard from all three speakers, again, just want to ask you to take a moment, maybe about 30 seconds, to really digest what you've heard, what you've learned, maybe take a few notes if that's your preferred style of learning. And then we'll begin a facilitated panel discussion and open it up for the audience for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. We can't promise that we'll get to all of the questions, but we do have a good bit of time together, and so we hope to get to as many questions as possible. So I'll pause there and give us about 30 seconds just to reflect, maybe jot down some notes before we move forward. All right, excellent. So just to kick things off for the panel discussion, as we bring all of the panelists to spotlight, so much of how we look at the outdoors in our public lands is shaped by the stories that we've been told, the stories that we tell ourselves, and our own personal experiences over time in those spaces. For most of us, for many of us, we grew up learning a very whitewashed version of history in the outdoors and as it relates to public lands. I know for me personally, growing up, I wouldn't have considered myself an outdoorsy person. I remember even some of my closest friends leaving on the weekends to go on these great backpacking trips and left me out just out of the assumption that Black people don't hike, Black people don't backpack. And I remember that narrative sitting with me strangely, but I remember it's still sitting with me nonetheless. And so hearing more from today's speakers, I hope that we all grow a little bit more curious to seek out more stories to gain a fuller understanding of our public lands history that I'm still trying to make sense of today. And so to dive into our panel discussion, I want to kick it off with the first questioning going to Richard Bugbee. Richard, could you unpack for us a little bit more? So you shared with us kind of the importance of our connection with nature and not seeing people as separate from, but connected to. Could you talk a little bit more with us about that, and about the connection between emotional and physical well-being, and connection to the land, self, and others, especially for the Native communities?
Okay, with us Native people, we have a connection with the plants and animals from our creation stories, and in our creation stories, we were all equal. We all talked and we all communicated, and we were all different beings, but we all communicated, and we in the beginning we didn't eat each other. we lived on white clay, so we were healthy because we ate dirt. anyway, it's another thing I have with young kids, that they need to eat more dirt. Anyway, so we have this connection that and then that we're related to these animals. And I gained all my knowledge and my kind of traditions and stuff from my grandfather. And I was lucky enough that he was always nearby, and he would take me hunting. But he would always kind of say a prayer to the animal before he would shoot it, and make sure he was good at it and had a nice shot and all this other stuff. But the we would eat a lot of deer meat, and but he took it with respect and used all the parts of the deer. I remember I would every deer hunt I would get a pair of chaps with a vest. I'm 73, so I'm old. There's cows running around and stuff. So our big crimes when we were kids were jumping on dairy cows and seeing how long you could stay on. Anyway, that was our crime sprees. Anyway, I forgot what I was going to. I'm into the dairy cows. So he would take me camping, and I would he showed me how to make shelters, and he would like not kidnap me, but take me in, and we'd be gone for a week or two out in the desert. And I learned a lot of, it'd be like 100 degrees out, and he'd show me how to make a fire. I was like, are you kidding me? I don't want, show me what plants and animals that, I could survive off of. And we didn't use it because we had our own food. Anyway, but he taught me a lot, and he was always there. And for those that are familiar with San Diego, his house was in East San Diego, where 805 goes through. There was a dip right there. And about El Cajon Boulevard and 805, somewhere around there. Anyway, his house was there, and he had a few horses and a couple cattle and a whole bunch of rabbits and a walnut grove and a pomegranate grove. But this is in a well-populated area now. So I grew up learning from him and having respect for the animals and plants and animals and such. And then I met my teacher, Jane Dumas, who's Kumeyaay. And I spent 35 years with her, and I spent 4 or 5 days a week with her for 35 years. And she taught me about plants, and she taught me about the language. But the very first thing, I listened to her for like 2 years before she even talked to me. And then when she finally talked to me, she says, "You want to go to my mother's gathering area?" And so I said, "Yeah." And we went to her gathering area. And then she wanted me to dig up a plant that was growing in the parking lot, and which she called Bethai. And so I dug this plant up. But she said before I dig it up, that I'm supposed to say, ask permission, say a prayer to the plant, and tell the plant what I'm going to do with it. Give it the plant intent. So I said a prayer and asked permission, and told him I was going to dig this plant, dig you up, and this elder is going to take you home. It ended up being Salvia apiana, or white sage. When I did it, there was a bunch. It was by a bridge area, and there's a bunch of kids, and there, and I guess they saw me talking to this plant, and they decided to leave. Thought I was a crazy guy talking plants. Anyway, then I found out you don't have to do this all out loud. You can sit there and mind meld with the plant. Anyway, but that was my very first lesson: is to treat the plant with respect, ask permission, and give the plant intent. For a while, no one knew what plant she was talking about, because she used her traditional language, and she had some funny English names that no one else used. So I went back to college and took a bunch of botany courses and learned the scientific names, and found out the scientific names change all the time, and the indigenous names have been the same for thousands and thousands of years. So why not teach the indigenous names? And you just have to learn that Bethai, as soon as you go up into Oceanside, becomes Kashil, and you go up to LA, it's Kasili, and so you just have to know the name changes in the space. And so that's been my focus, actually. Is to identify the different plants and their different names in the indigenous languages. Also, I worked on a little pamphlet about for doctors at Indian health centers, identifying different herbs that Native people might be taking that would cause adverse effects with prescriptions, or they do the same thing as another prescription, and so that doctors can adjust their, I guess, their prescription knowledge dosage to the different patients, because plants have a lot of native plants have a lot of medicinal qualities to them, and sometimes you have to be careful of that sometimes.
So, thank you, Richard. One of the things that I pulled from what you were sharing was just the importance of harmony, living in harmony with, and the respect for both plants and animals. I think that's so powerful. It has broader macro implications as well on sustainability, how we protect our environment, how we use and how we waste, and how we can be better stewards of the land as well. And even mitigate some of the impact of climate change. So kind of shifting over a little bit, I'm curious, as one of our later modules, we'll kind of dive into deeper around climate change as well as conservation. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between Native American concepts of conservation and land use versus some of the more Western philosophies around that as well?
So I've heard other people say that we treat the forest like our home and we keep it clean. And we have this a little conflict between Forest Service agencies and or land agencies and Native people, because the agencies, they seem that they're in control of the land. This is kind of their land, but it's not their land. It's our territory. And they have to have this management regime on the land, where we have this. It's not it's an obligation to take care of the land. We're obligated to it. We're attached to it. We can never be unattached to it. Again, we got to remember it. So we have this attitude of land back too. And I work a lot with the Munajula Yokum Bay people in Australia, and they're putting Aboriginal people in charge of their national parks. They're putting Aboriginal people. The museums are returning artifacts to places they're setting up on. They call them reserves instead of reservations, called holding places, so that they're returning the things back to the people. The agencies don't like that land back idea, and so one of the effects is one of the ways we clean up is with fire. The land agencies, they had for a long time, they had a Smoky Bear policy: don't touch it and watch it overgrow and tangle. They didn't realize, there've been people taking care of that land for tens of thousands of years. And then they decided, control burns, which control burns are different than what we want to use. We want to use cultural burns. And control burns are focused on acreage and a big mass of fire and burn a certain acreage to make fire breaks. And with cultural burns, your focus are on plant communities. This plant community needs to be burned. So control burns are bigger and less of them, but cultural burns are cyclitic and they're mosaic, and so they're smaller and there's more of them, and they do make, the secondary effect is they do make fire breaks. But healthy plant communities don't burn. A healthy forest, the canopies don't touch. There's open spaces between trees. There's meadows form. He's talking about the perfect meadow. There are a perfect meadow. There's the inlets and the exits that have to be just right to form these meadows. And we had a lot of meadows because our water table was higher. We had springs. In our traditional talks, we talk about, we didn't drink water from lakes and big bodies of water. We drank water that came out of the springs, because we said they had these little monsters. I think it's called what's it called? Whatever it is, that disease, not that disease, but that bacteria. But we knew what it was, and so I guess we have a name for those, for that, whatever that is. We just, So we have we use fire in these cultural words. In the Luiseño or the Payomkowishum people, our language is called Chantel. And in Chantel, we have 3 words for fire. There's yut, which means fire, and there's yut and another word, which means fire that burns itself, which is a forest fire. And then we have a chapena, which is a cultural burn, meaning you light a fire in several places in a circle and it burns to the center. And I think the best of both worlds is to use the technologies the Forest Service and those land agencies have with their trucks and their protective clothing and their water and helicopters and all that stuff with our knowledge, because we've had 10,000 years of knowledge of how things work. And you got to realize we didn't wear clothes in the old days, so we did these cultural burns. We had to be really good at it, and we put them out with our feet. And we actually have a dance that we do that with a dance, and so we had tough feet anyway. There's a guy named Mike Wass. His name is Yellow Sky, and he was a runner, and he would run from Coronado Island to Yuma and back, barefoot, in a diaper, with dreads. His dreads drug on the ground anyway, I guess to wipe out his tracks. But look him up someday. His name is Yellow Sky, and he was Kumeyaay. Anyway, so we had tough feet. But just to have that's one of the things we have to do when we have to do a cultural burn. What the agencies want us to wear that something text clothing and the hard hat with a little thing on the back and all that stuff. And but we've been pretty successful with our burns up actually in Northern California. They're what they're doing is it's called treks, is training exercises, and they bring in all the different tribal fire agencies, and they train by doing these little cultural burns. Maybe to bring back, and the one I have a video of is bringing back hazel shoots so they can do their basketry. A lot of their stuff is for basketry.
Thanks.
And the other problem we have too is after a burn, they want to plant pine trees, and up in the mountains, black oaks are the trees that belong up in the mountains. In our creation story, with the Kumeyaay creation story, there was a battle between the oaks and the pine trees a long time ago, and the oaks won, and they kicked the pine trees out of the Kumeyaay Mountains, and they sent the ones to the east, and they became the pinyon pines, and they sent the other ones to the west, and they became the Tory pines. But they left a few pines up in the mountains, but nothing continuous. And that's why they had those bad forest fires, because it's all filled up with these pine trees that are coming back for retaliation, evidently. Anyway.
Thank you for sharing that, for giving us just small glimpses of ethnobotany as well as indigenous land management practices that
land relationships
and land relationships. Yeah, better than land management. The land needs to be managed. If anything, we need to be managed. Thank you for that. So shifting over, and I was going to say shifting gears, but As Jose mentioned, we're not machines, and so that's something that's come to my consciousness. Wanted to toss this question over to Jose and Teresa. In our conversations leading up to this panel discussion, we talked about the concept of being complicit in good work. And Teresa and I often joke, and Jose as well, about being troublemakers in this work, taking from the powerful words of the late John Lewis, causing good trouble, getting into good trouble. And so with that, wanted to ask a pretty broad, open-ended question. What are the differences for us on this call between being complicit in good work and being complicit in inequity? And I think that's super important, especially as some people might be looking at inequities and injustices and might feel, even on this call, personally attacked, or they feel like, I have no responsibility in this, not recognizing the foundation that was already laid in inequity. How can we be more complicit in good work rather than complicit in inequity? Pass it over to Teresa first.
What I would say to start, Richard, you shared some things that I had not thought about, such as land relationships versus land management. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. What I would say is that a lot of what people are hearing today and have been hearing for a while can be difficult to take in. We don't want to see ourselves as bad people. We want to see ourselves as being good stewards. And when we're told that the way we are doing something is having a negative effect on not just the land, but the people, that's hard to take. When I lead with good, I don't want to be told that the outcome has been bad. So, hearing words like white supremacy, that's hard to swallow. That's hard to hear. So I think we have to adjust how we hear. I think a lot of what all of us are doing is trying to move beyond, we're trying to get unstuck. And we don't always have the right answers, but we're trying to. We fail too. So I think what we need to understand is that people who have been systemically excluded, or people from underrepresented communities, these are issues that we have to deal with on the daily, whilst others may be able to excuse themselves. We have to deal with this on the daily. So what I need, and I'm only going to speak for me, I need people to understand that it's going to be hard. This work is freaking hard. We try to make it fun and we try to be joyful in what we do, but this freaking work is hard. It's hard to do something different. It's hard when you came into a system that was already in place and you've been taught to act within that system the same, to not challenge that system. What we need are people who will challenge this freaking system, period. Because while we talk about all these issues, what we are really talking about is how this country and others have placed upon us all a system of exclusion. So now we have to undo that system. How the hell do we undo that system? It has to be done from within. People have to put on knee-high boots and step out in it and understand that the change is going to be difficult. And the results you may not see in your lifetime. Just like those who came before me set into action, set into motion, things that they didn't live to see, but I'm bearing witness to it now. So that's what we have to accept, is that the change we are working towards, we may not see, but we have to understand that it's necessary so that those who come after us won't have to deal with the same BS that we're dealing with. So I need people who are ready to say, skip it. Challenge everything that we know is not helping. Question everything. That's how we bring about change. People who go along to get along, you are part of the problem. So that's what we have to change. It's hard to hear. It's hard for me when my 11-year-old niece comes to me and challenges me on stuff. I'm like, what? You're 11. But she's right. So we have to change how we accept information we receive and not always look at it like, oh, it's us against them. No, it should be everybody for the environment. Look at all these freaking fires that are happening here in California and elsewhere. Year after year, this happens. We're not freaking learning. So what that tells me is we need to try something different. So I need people who will try something different, period.
Thanks so much for that, Reverend Baker. I think you took us to church a little bit there. I saw in the chat, we're talking about preach on it, and coming from a Black church, a Black Christian background, we know what hands raised definitely means. I think there's a lot of agreement in the chat. Jose, maybe to add to that question a little bit for you, in your presentation, one of the things that you said subtly but so powerfully is that there's work that groups of people need to do for and with themselves. That was really powerful, and I think it segued off a neat conversation that one of the groups was having at a retreat that we had with a smaller cohort of leaders for outdoor equity around what is each of our responsibility in this work. And one of the members of the group I remember shared, people of color carry no responsibility in this work. This is work that should only sit with white people or with the dominant culture. And so I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. What is each of our responsibility, recognizing the privilege and the trauma that different groups and different individuals carry?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a lot in there. And I'll try to frame this in a way that also connects to what Richard and Teresa have said in their own respectively powerful ways. And I'll also use the example of fire, because I want to stress and honor some of the things that have been shared. So first, it's when I shared those examples of like colonization and reductive mechanistic framing and a life-affirming logic, what I'm looking at is to say there's always things we're going to be fighting against. That is part of the work. And I want to balance that with what are we fighting for? So we're also in that creation stage and that envisioning of what we're building in as much as what we're destroying. Because as it connects to fire, again, I presume many of you may already be familiar with the work of Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, the book Braiding Sweetgrass. If it's not, I think that provides a good entry point as a framework into the diversity of Native community across the U.S. That's important, because don't default into harmful homogeneity there. And so I say that because it's that fire comes out to be able to say if the reductive binary that's oppressive around fire, it's bad, right? And that is, as Richard pointed, that kind of Smokey Bear type of approach, that all fire is bad because it's burning the trees that we want to harvest. And so unpacking that to recognize that there can be harmful, destructive fire. There can be sacred fire. There can be creative fire. There can be different elements of fire if you understand how to approach it in that way. And so to Richard's point around not just prescribed burning as controlled burn, but as a ceremonial burn, because now you're not just looking at the task of it, but I think honoring the sacredness of it, the ceremony of it. That points to Robin Wills' Kumeyaay idea of reciprocity, right? As we really paid attention to reciprocity, then that comes with the responsibility that comes to the landscape. So when I look at that as the work that we do in our social spaces around equity and inclusion work and whatnot, I've said like a lot of what, especially in California, a lot of wildfires that are burning is our past practices have caught up and are compounded by climate change. Past practices is this reductive, oppressive approach to fire, such that we've built up tinderboxes, right? We've treated fire as bad, and now we're paying a consequence of that. Climate change is we broke a cycle, carbon cycle for sure, but we've disrupted some of these regenerative cycles that exist in the planet, in our landscape. So when I look at what that looks like socially, I say, what are the regenerative cycles we have broken within ourselves and with each other? And so therefore, what do we need to tend to heal to that? How have we created a social climate change along with the ecological one? For fire is how have we treated conflict, tension, that type of fire as suppressive, and being able to say, no, you are being a disruptive person of color in the workplace. We can't have that. Let's not talk about hard stuff. Like, let's just keep it professional. There's different ways in which we've created that own tinderbox. And so I say, I can't be surprised when we quote unquote have, as an example, social, racial unrest. I'm like, because that is a fire that we have set up for, and then can't be surprised that that needs to be expressed because then all it takes is little sparks to set that off. And that we can't firefight our way out of that. It's about being able to say, what are we doing in respect to the health of the land? So I look at that to the health of the community. So that's why I asked that question, quote unquote, not just what prescribed burning, how are we thinking about prescribed burning on the landscape for the health of the landscape, right? So we can have healthy succession, so things can grow, so it can honor the tending of what is supposed to be there at Richard's point, right? So like if this is the oaks are saying, hey, help us out here, you're helping, you're helping who's not supposed to be here as an example. I look at that to say, so what prescribed burning do we practice in our social spaces, in our relational spaces with each other? How do we approach that as a way to say some things need to burn so that we can have healthy succession? Because if we only approach it from the bad fire, which is either A, let's not talk about it, let's not do it, or the bad fire is like, let's just burn it all down, then that is what we're having on the landscape right now. So that's what I mean about like, what is the work that we do so that we're responsible fire starters? That's the good trouble, on Teresa's point, because it isn't just about having ceremonial fires. You actually have to have people that know how to hold and prescribe that fire. Otherwise, I'm like, I'm not interested in being an arsonist. And I'm also not interested in being, an oppressive fire neglector, if that makes sense. And that's work, because that invites me into that space, that diverse space that's not the binary of just good and or bad. And yeah, as Deanna points on there, toxic masculinity, it's another layer of that. But those are aspects of what then we're trying to put as a framework. Because for me, I want to say, like, look, as a Latino male, as part of the Latinx community, as I hold spaces of colonizer and colonized. The Spanish roots there, I use colonizer languages in the form of English and Spanish. As I also, the indigeneity of my ancestors that has been suppressed, as well as knowing that in the US, having a Latinx identity was wrapped up along with the suppression of other communities of color. And so like that is the space for me to be able to say, if I don't heal with and from that, if I don't move with that, then it's easier for me to default into a binary that would only perpetuate oppression and inequities, right? It would only mean that I then don't pay attention as to how toxic masculinity exists in this space. It would mean that I am not paying attention in terms of how I use the tools of the oppressor, so to speak. And it also means that I'm not asking the questions of what have I inherited that no longer serves me, so I can create that future that we talk about. Knowing that is hard. I'll close with this because Teresa's point, some of these are models that we haven't had or that we need to remember in terms of what those relationships are, because we're working through a lot of healing that needs to happen, and not everyone's ready for that because it's messy, it's hard, it's gooey, it's challenging, but that's part of the work.
Whew. There's so much in there, so much in what each of you shared, that I hope folks are hearing this and really getting pieces from all of this. All right, I'm just taking it in for just a brief sec. So I think so much of this conversation has landed also personally, which is very intentional. And hoping that folks are hearing both the broader systemic issues and the role that each of us play within those on that personal level as well. And so kind of going to some of the questions in the chat box, as well as some that have been shared with me directly. All right, so one was, Teresa, how are you working to diversify? And I want to broaden that question out to all three of our panelists. What I think the audience is asking for, what are some of the tactics? What are some of the strategies? Teresa, when we first met, I think it was 2 years ago at Outdoor Retailer, I think I made the mistake of asking Teresa, what organization do you work for? Or, like, who are you with? And Teresa said, I'm not a part of an organization, I'm a part of a movement. And in that was single-handedly and then brought on a broader network of people that have fundamentally shook up the outdoor industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that work? Feel free to brag openly about some of the successes of that work to hopefully inspire our audience around some of the ways that they can affect change.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, this work is hard. So I try to do things that are fun in the outdoors. That's how I try and bring people into this work, is by having programs in place that engage people in outdoor activities, hiking, camping, things like that. I think it's important when you reach out to someone and ask them to come to your location and do a cleanup, it's important that these people you are asking already have a relationship with that spot, because it feels like work when you tell me, come and volunteer to clean up a park, and I don't have a relationship with that park. So I try and create relationships with the land so that we feel connected, so that we have a sense of responsibility when we're asked to do cleanups and such. It's cool to have panels like this because they can reach an audience, such as the agencies that are sitting here with us today. But it's also important to get out and connect with the people. I don't want to be invited somewhere and the superintendent of that park isn't there. I want to speak with people in leadership, not just your marketing department, not just your interns, not just your volunteers. I want to make sure that everyone plays a role in this work. And all too often, that's not the case. So that's how I do this work, is by asking for commitments from people in leadership roles, founders, CEOs, etc. I think it's important to see that, you know, they too have skin in the game. You know, so when I'm sitting on the outside and I'm not seeing them, but the directive is coming from these people in leadership roles, I'm like, you're not connecting with the people, so you don't really hear from me directly. I want to be able to speak with people directly so they can hear what our concerns are. So what I can say to the people that are here today is, when you go out and you have interactions with the public, ask your superintendents, you know, park leadership to come with you so that we can see everyone cares. It's not just a few, you know, and as we talk about this work around racial disparities, the problem is we are siloing the issues as if they are separate from the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is race. And this country has a problem dealing with race. So that's what we're talking about here. You know, we're talking about race. And as difficult of a conversation that is to have, we better start having it sooner than later. Because with the racial demographic shift that's taking place in this country, it's going to demand that people like us are involved in not just the conversation, but the work. So, yeah, I'll end there because I want to hand it over to the word wizard, Mr. Gonzalez.
Well, actually, before I let you off the hook, Teresa, just wanted to open space for a quick plug as well. So you also lead the Outdoor CEO Pledge, and there are a lot of organizations and agencies that are on this call right now that I think could really benefit from not only taking the pledge, kind of doing that surface level work, but then also diving deeper with your team. Could you share a little bit about that and maybe a link or how they can connect there?
Yeah, you know, I don't want to point to the pledge as the work. It's not. The pledge isn't the work. The work is what comes after people commit to signing the pledge. And about a month ago, Chris Perkins, who works on the pledge with me, we stopped taking new applications because what we want to do moving forward is the work behind the pledge. We want to have collaborations with these organizations, foundations, retailers. We want to have people doing the work, and we don't want to have to point to someone and say, see, we care, we're working with this group of, you know, people of color or people from underrepresented communities. We want to be inclusive of who we work with so we don't have to point to them, that it's just automatically there. But the CEO Pledge was formed 3 years ago, and we have 181 companies, be it nonprofits, brands, retailers, that are committed through the pledge to do this work. But I don't want people to feel they can point to the pledge and say, see, we've done it. There's a report that people can click on to see the work that these companies are doing. And if companies sign and do absolutely nothing, we remove them. Because again, it's not about the pledge, it's not being able to point to something and as your work when you've done nothing but commit to it. I want to see people doing the work without signing the pledge. Signing the pledge is not going to help us when it comes to environmental protection if you aren't doing the work. So I applaud everyone who has stepped up and signed the pledge. I applaud everyone who has said, I have to be the agent of change, and this is what I bring to the table.
Thanks so much for that, Teresa. All right, I'll let you off the hook. We can hop over to you were passing it over to Jose. Jose, in terms of tactics and strategies, and also wanting to give you a space to maybe brag on Latino Outdoors a little bit and the work that your organization has done across the country. Part of the bringing together of this network for leaders for outdoor equity is also to help facilitate relationships between many of the land managers on this call, organizations on this call, with community-based groups that are actively working and actively in the trenches of breaking down some of the systemic barriers to access. Could you tell us a little bit about how Latino Outdoors is doing that, and any other offerings that you have as well?
Yeah, I can be pithy. I mean, first of all, in terms of, I think, the Latino Outdoors work, if you're in the San Diego area, reach out. I see Manuel and Cassie are in the participant mode. So they are a perfect example of leadership in action, if you will, doing the work. So to Teresa's point, because if you ask them, they have chosen and taken the responsibility on a couple of fronts. One is to be visible. And with the Latino Outdoors leaders, I would often say, the magic of the work that comes from you is you. And how do you make obvious what may not be seemingly obvious to you in terms of what you represent to who you're inviting, to families, to kids, and be able to say, oh, they're doing it too. Right? That's part of the structural work that Outdoor Outreach is also trying to do, to be able to say, not just to have, I've often said, it isn't just about having our communities be the objects of programming, right? We get taken out by well-meaning organizations and white leadership and so forth. But what does it mean to have us also representative in the leadership components of that? Because that makes a difference. And then second, that they have taken the challenge and the responsibility of partnerships, that, you know, they are the ones working directly with the Refuge, with Outdoor Outreach, with working what it is to secure grant funding. So we'll definitely speak out to Manuel as an example, right? Like that is part of not just the work, but what I want it to be acknowledged and seen as skill building, because those are all meant to be transferable skills regardless of the space that you're in. It's about valuing the multiple hats rather than just saying, oh, well, no, you're showing up as Latino Outdoors leaders, so you can't really show up in the work that you're also doing for this space and this space and that organization. I'm like, no, that has to be that type of community leadership and action, because that's the way that we're our whole selves. So there's that element. And then lastly, that they are in the position of really being intentional about defining what the work looks like, because it isn't a prescription to say, cool, well, this is how you need to speak about holding a Latinx identity, and this is how you need to speak in terms of what outdoor recreation means. It is through the work and through your action, you're getting to show what is that expansiveness of a Latinx identity in an expansive of outdoor activities. The spaces, of course, you're going out into physical trails, into physical spaces, but what it's gonna look like, it's gonna come from that co-creation. It's going to come from not a prescription of curriculum and pedagogy, but rather of what is emergent through that work. And that's easy to say, but can be hard to do, because again, we're really working on challenging models around how we're supposed to have something very clean and mechanical, out of which we can get outputs and deliverables and metrics and things to justify fundings and so forth. And yes, some of that is needed, and not to be limited only by that and be able to say, well, you only took out 15 youth rather than 100 youth. That's more impressive on a grant deliverable. Like, yes, and the way in which for these 15 youth, it's going to be a transformative experience that is, you are, you know, it's like the proverbial, you're planting the seeds of the tree for which the shade might not be for you, but you have no idea what that impact looks like. Like seed tending is so magical because it's all in there. And you know, it's like the phrase goes, you can count the number of seeds in the fruit, but to try to count the number of fruit in the seeds, to me, that's less useful than acknowledging I am tending to what is going to create and grow into that. So I hope that helps. And then lastly, philosophically, I'm wearing my shirt that says protect Black joy, respect Native sovereignty, embrace queer worth, and so forth, as an example to say, when I talk about Black joy, we should, of course, protect everyone's joy. What this is saying is protect Black joy because that is a focused element that tends to be destroyed and attacked and erased. For sovereignty, of course, we all have respective sovereignty, but for Native sovereignty, that is a specific element that has been denied, that gets attacked and destroyed and so forth. And so those are engagement points for me about how to approach equity as a component of what has created these inequities, these spaces for that, so that we can actually work on what we preach for equality.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Jose. Richard, coming over to you as well. I know that you've done some tremendous work alongside state parks and several other land management agencies around rules, regulations, and permitting. Would you mind sharing a little bit there as well around what have been some of the strategies, maybe policies that you've advocated for there, as well as more outside of that, any offerings that you might have?
Yeah, I was with the Native American Advisory Council for state parks until it got disbanded. The governor was that Wilson? Yeah, he sounds like some guy that would do that. Anyway, all advisory groups like that were disbanded in California during that term of government. So, but when I was with them, it was a very good group of people that was on this advisory group. There's only 2 of us left alive. The rest of us are gone. There was Charlie Cook from the Chumash area. Down with Kumeyaay was Clarence Brown from Viejas. And then I was on it. The other guy alive is, I can't think of his name right now. The guy from who's Mono, from North Fork Mono. Anyway, he does the fire, he does the burnings and stuff. He was actually a little bit younger than me. And then another lady, Vivian Hailstone, who was Hoopa and Yurok and Karuk. Usually the people up there are all 3 tribes. We had this amazing ability to look at a basket and say, this is a Hoopa basket married to a Yurok. And she could combine the tribal different ways of making basket. Anyway, she's a very good basket weaver. Vivian and me, we put together a gathering permit for California Indian basket weavers, that they could gather plants on state park lands to make baskets. The big problem is they had a taboo against gathering stuff, and I guess unless you're the lumber industry, gathering stuff and making money off of it. So we did this gathering permit. We also put a provision that the elders could send agents to go gather for them, younger people. I should explain that when I first started with my teacher, she was probably in her late 60s and maybe early 60s. And she would go gather, and I was her lookout. And so we had this elder lady gathering acorns and acting like and I was the lookout guy, the kind of the getaway driver. Anyway, and then as we got older, she couldn't climb the fences anymore, so I became the gatherer and she was the lookout. But it was always strange to me that this lady had to have was kind of paranoid about gathering food from her own land, from from our and not really disturbing anything because those acorns have been producing for tens of thousands of years to feed our people. Um, um, and we know that when oak trees drop their acorns, that the first drop we don't take. We let that's for the animals. The second drop is for us. That's when we go gather them. And so we know when to gather them, and we're doing things the right way. After a while, I wanted to know why we were gathering them, because there's I don't know if you know about eating acorns, but it's a long process. There's only a short window you can gather them out in. You have to store them for a whole year. And you have to gather enough for a whole year. There's something we ate every day. I made the mistake of saying they were our main food. They're not our main food. They're our staple food. Like you have rice or beans or potatoes, it's what we ate with every meal. And then I wondered, why did we go through this process? Because you have to gather it, dry it, crack it, winnow it, grind it, sift it, regrind it, leach it, and then cook it. And that's a long process to do that for every meal. Why did we have to eat these acorns? Because our main food was meat. But our meat is not the same as the meat we have today. We didn't have cows and pigs, and well, we have these little small chickens called quail, but and the thing with deer meat and rabbit meat and our favorite wood rat meat, it has no fat in it. There's no fat. There's not enough fat in the meat to sustain your body. It's almost all protein. And what's acorns, it's really high in this really good fat. And so our food was full of supplements to make us healthy. Like we didn't drink milk. We have once you're weaned from your mom, you never drank milk. There were no cows. Deer were uncooperative. And so you didn't drink milk the rest of your life. And from you're a little kid to you're a young adult, what's growing the most is your bones, and so what builds good bones? We ground up bones into our food, and we ate bone meal. And so it was full of supplements that made us healthy. I have old pictures. When I worked at the Museum of Man, I've seen old pictures, and I have old pictures of Kumeyaay people taken in the late 1800s, and they're like 120, 130 years old. So they were very healthy. I have a picture of a lady that's 112 standing with her hands on her hips, like more straighter than I do. Anyway, so we're eating this healthy food. We're growing very old. And I was thinking about the knowledge I gained from my grandfather. And that was just one person. And if you lived in a village, you're going to learn from your grandparents, but you have 4 grandparents. If you're living that old, you have great grandparents. If you're living that old, you have great grandparents. So there's, was there eight of the ones and 16 of the other ones. And so each child has like 40 teachers that know him and relate to him and know exactly what he wants to learn and has the knowledge to feed this child knowledge, instead of having one teacher for 40 students, where they have to spread the knowledge around. So our form of education and knowing about the land and knowing about who we are, and it was a much different system. And anyway, our our relationship with our place of belonging is kind of been severed. You know, we have special places that don't belong to us anymore, that we feel are kind of sacred. You know, I used to take care of a place called Piedras Pintadas in Rancho Bernardo, and I fought this construction site, and as it got sooner for the construction site, I was actually in the construction business. I became part of the destruction, and I had to quit and everything. And this rock art, it was a rock art site, and the rock art site was never defaced or had a problem, except for teenagers would go there at night and party. What they did was they fenced it off, and when they fenced it off, everybody started jumping over the fence and tagging it, and it became a problem. It's actually a woman's puberty site, and that's actually where I ended up having my first child was a boy, but the rest of them were girls, and so they're pretty close in age. So I had their puberty ceremony. They're not a totally traditional one, but it connected them to the place, and I told them, you know, who they are, and then we went out to Denny's and ate because they wanted to paint on the rocks. And I said, no, this is where we stop. Anyway.
Thanks so much for that, Richard.
Sure.
So just in closing, as we have probably about five minutes left before we shift over to break and then head into the leadership session, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to just to reflect from your lens and from where you stand in this work. Have we made progress? And then also leaving with, what would be your last charge for our audience here today, moving forward and moving this work forward? Have we made progress? And what's your last charge? Maybe in one breath or in 1 minute.
I think we have made progress. We've made progress with people, but not progress with land. And land is what will sustain us. So we have much to do around the protection of the environment. But, you know, all the land agencies that are on here, I applaud you for doing this hard ass work. I think we are making progress. There's so much more to be done, but we need to demand change. We can't just sit in change and say it's happening, I've done my part. There's so much more to do. So I challenge you to challenge the system in which we are in.
Thank you for that, Teresa. Richard or Jose, would you like to go next?
After you, Richard.
Yeah, just we have a word. Sometimes a person asks me, how do you say remember in our language? And everybody was telling her how to recall things. And I told her the word how to belong again. And I think we need to remember the land, meaning we need to belong again to the land. Like I said before, in Kumeyaay, your body is mat, the land is mat. You know, it's the same. It's almost the same. It's you know, the body of the earth and your body are, it's the same thing. You know, a lot of times when I say a prayer to the plant, sometimes I say, well, you know, I'll nurture you someday. you know, your babies, you know, and I just feel this connection, and we need to be connected, and we need to look at, look at nature as, look at this as a part of us. This is, how cool am I? How cool is it? It's all the same.
So thank you, Richard. And Jose?
And I would say that in a similar way to say, I've worked on approaching my work as this idea of healing severed connections, because it centers me on healing and being able to pay attention to what has been severed and what that work looks like. And so I do believe we've made progress, similar as Teresa. My question and concern is whether we facilitate that progress or we make that progress in spite of how much we resist. And it goes back to those demographic shifts that I spoke to. And so you see the aspects of that in the same way with climate change. There's a way in which we make progress, but sometimes it feels after having tried every other possible alternative. And I wish it would be different in that way. And lastly, as a call to action, I would say for everyone in that frame that I said about structural change and about what are the procedural type of things that you can change, what are the relational things that you can change, and what are the mental models you can change, is to go out there. And as you move in the space, in the world, in your relations, in your workplaces, in your roles, it can start by going out and really thinking about how your relationship with that tree is different, to going out there and thinking about how am I complicit in allyship compared to complicit in systemic oppression, and how I choose to have conversations with the people that need to have that. And then lastly, with the power that you hold, what does that look like about changing the environmental spaces in which then those actions can move, so that you're swimming with the current rather than against the current.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jose, Richard, and Teresa, for this really rich conversation. I hope that our audience has taken a lot away, taken a lot of notes, taken away a lot of both personal and introspective reflection, as well as reflection on the application to our work and how we show up to this work. So thank you again to our phenomenal panelists. At this time, it is now 10:51, and so as we close this session and as the smaller cohort jumps into the leadership session, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break. So we ask that you join back at the link provided to you at 11:06, and we'll meet with Dr. Zachary Green from there. Thank you again so much. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for showing up in this work.